The date was November 1864. The orders had been given, the commands carried out. General Sherman was headed down present-day Route 278 for the Atlantic coast, and Savannah with his 99,000 Federal troops. Atlanta lay behind smoldering, for the most part destroyed. With their torches, the Yankee soldiers put an end to a city that was only getting started. Officially recognized in 1845, the 19-year-old community was home to 10,000 people. For all practical purposes, Atlanta was done. Yet somehow, somewhere, an attitude arose from these ashes. An expectation that was recognized by Margaret Mitchell with Scarlett O'Hara's closing remarks, "Tomorrow is another day." People that know Atlanta know that this wasn't the first display of such determination. It was there at the first council meeting in 1838. Today, Atlanta is known around the world. For a town whose coffers had but $1.64 after the Civil War, it's truly remarkable that she stands to earn some $3.4 billion with the upcoming Olympics alone. Who were these early people, and how did this ever happen? This is Kirk Abner, and I want to thank you for taking me along. Atlanta is not really an old place as far as permanent settlements, that is. When you think that New York City was first settled by immigrants in the 1630s, St. Augustine, Florida in 1565, and even Nashville, Tennessee in 1779, then Atlanta proper seems a much younger sibling, with her beginning in only the early 1800s. What's really odd, though, is the fact that Savannah, the first town in Georgia, and only a 3-hour drive now to the east, was inhabited some 100 years earlier. James Oglethorpe, the philanthropist, landed on the Georgia coast in 1732 with his collection of well-meaning debtors. But it would be 1822 before members of his town would venture this far west. The landscape, the eastern flow of the rivers, and the presence of Indians deterred them for a full century. But the Atlanta area, in fact most of northwest Georgia, was already home to several thousand Indians of the Creek and Cherokee tribes. Actually, these were part of a much larger Indian population known to scholars as the Muskogees. Creek was a term applied by the British, and it referred to the natives who dwelled in eastern Alabama and western Georgia among the many creeks and streams. These Indians were descendants of Native Americans who lived on the western plains. Unlike their ancestors, who lived constantly on the move, these tribes lived a very sedentary existence, maintaining villages, planting crops, and the like. Locally, their main camp was called Peachtree Standing and was situated on the banks of the Chattahoochee River, on the property now owned by the river pumping station and waterworks. Trade and traffic heading north to their settlement in Etowah, Allatoona, and Nacoochee was significant, and the river was most easily crossed at the site, being so shallow. It wasn't long before the Indians got caught up in what could be considered an international conflict of imperialism. England, France, and Spain sent explorers and troops to the uncivilized Gulf coastal regions. All developed trading practices with the Indians and bargained as best they could for Indian assistance against one another. Spain even developed relations with the Indians to the point of providing them arms and munitions in their fight with the American colonists who were beginning a move west. The Indian wars that erupted were chronic and managed to deter the outright settlement by the colonists. The governor of Georgia came close to seceding from the young nation, had help in combating the natives not arrived when it did. It was during the presidency of Andrew Jackson that the conflict was finally settled, and these early Indians were led out of their homeland to reservations west of the Mississippi River on what became known as the Trail of Tears. The white man's gain was the Indians' loss. It was a sad chapter in American history. Today, Atlanta is described as the most heavily forested urban area in the United States. It's even called the Dogwood City on account of the vast number of dogwoods. But oddly enough, the peach tree is not among the indigenous species here. It's almost humorous for a town that has no less than 363 businesses with the name Peachtree that there is some doubt as to the original term and intent. Atlanta historian Franklin Garrett tells us that the original reference may have been pitch tree standing, referring to the common yellow pine and its frequent tar or pitch secretion. For the sake of some 30 roadways and all the peach tree businesses, the 1894 Atlanta Constitution presented an interview with George Washington Collier, the Atlanta postmaster, who personally recalled seeing a peach tree in the vicinity. One of the first white settlers in present-day Atlanta was Charner Humphreys. He also had claim to the first painted house, the only painted house in the new territory. In fact, his place and the whole community became known as Whitehall, named for the historic district in London. These early Atlantans were a hardy people and were quite dependent on the various creeks and streams around here. Running water was the most efficient source of power and helped run the grinders for the corn and the like. You'll notice several streets in the county named for their original owners. For example, Moore's Mill, Williams Mill, Wilson Mill, Brown's Mill, and Howell Mill, to name a few. Buckhead, a high-dollar suburb to the north, had an interesting but often misquoted early history. K.C. Smith, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, assures me that there was indeed a head of a buck posted, but it served as a marker along one of the routes crossing the Chattahoochee River. Naturally, all traffic heading west would go to the Buck's Head and make the turn. Henry Irby owned a tavern and store and would have done quite well with his land investment if he were alive today. He paid $225 for 202.5 acres that later became a racetrack, then a Sears store, and now is the site of Buckhead Plaza. It's no wonder that Buckhead is known as one of the wealthiest unincorporated suburbs in America and one of the three most prestigious neighborhoods in the South, along with Georgetown near D.C., and Palm Beach, Florida. Decatur, just east of downtown, is actually the older and was the more formidable township in northwestern Georgia. Citizens from the Atlanta area had to go to Decatur to conduct their usual business dealings. That ceased in 1847 when residents voted to reincorporate as the city of Atlanta. It was December 1836 when the Georgia General Assembly approved a measure that would rank as one of the most significant directives in this city's destiny. Funds were allocated for the purpose of extending the railroad from a point on the Chattahoochee River in DeKalb County north to the Tennessee border, only 90 miles away. An hour and 15-minute drive today, a 2-hour train ride back then. Still, this development would for the most part concentrate the future growth of Georgia to the northern third of the state, and too it would position the future capital, Atlanta, between the Midwest and their destination port of Savannah. Eventually, it attracted other railroads, 14 lines, and 4 major railway centers. By 1837, Atlanta would become the most important railway connector south of the Mason-Dixon. Service was complete to Augusta, and that made this 173-mile route the longest in the world. The engineer for the project, well-meaning but fortunately inaccurate, Stephen Long, made these remarks when he drove the spike and changed the name of the place to Terminus. It may be good for a tavern, a blacksmith shop, a grocery store, but not much else. Well, history and Atlanta both showed this fella a thing or two. A visit by Governor Wilson Lumpkin brought about yet another change in the designation to Marthasville, in honor of his daughter. It was a historic moment that Christmas Eve in 1842 when the locomotive Florida was hauled into town by 16 mules and began her maiden run. I spoke to the Atlanta historian Franklin Garrett about the significance of the early railroads.
Atlanta started in 1837 and the cause of its birth, you might say, was railroads. Uh, Atlanta has been a transportation center ever since. The state of Georgia decided to build a railroad back in 1836. There was a great deal of competition between our principal port, Savannah, and South Carolina's principal port, Charleston. And South Carolina got the drop on us a little bit by building a South Carolina railroad, which I believe was finished in 1830. So Georgia decided to get into the act, tap the interior, and bring the produce thereof out to our main port. So the Western and Atlantic Railroad was chartered by the state legislature in 1836. And of course, the first thing you do if you're going to build a railroad is to survey the right of way. The idea was to connect the Tennessee River and the Chattahoochee River. And so the surveys were made in 1837 under the direction of Stephen Harriman Long, who was a well-known Army civil engineer. We have a bust of him upstairs. And so the surveys were made. The act creating the railroad specified that the northern terminal shall be at Ross's Landing on the Tennessee River. That's now Chattanooga. And the southern terminus was somewhat more vague. It simply said it shall be on the south bank of the Chattahoochee River in DeKalb County, and Fulton County was still in DeKalb then. Fulton did not come into being as a separate county until 1853. Anyway, the southern terminus shall be on the south bank of the Chattahoochee River at a point suitable for running branch lines, and it named several somewhat older Georgia towns like Columbus, Macon, etc. So the civil engineers made a survey, and they decided to cross the Chattahoochee River at the site of the ancient Indian village, the Standing Peach Tree, which provided that well-known name for us, even though it's been a bit overworked. And so that's where they crossed, at Bolton. And they couldn't find a suitable terminal point right on the bank of the river. What they were looking for were ridges. So they proceeded in the direction of the future site of Atlanta and hit the jackpot in what's now downtown Atlanta, where Founder Street crosses the railroad tracks under the World Congress Center. They found a confluence there, or a junction is a better word for it, of three ridges. And in September 1837, civil engineers' benchmark was driven in the ground, marking the southern terminus of the state-built railroad. It remained there for 5 years. Then the gentleman who owned property to the east of the original point, Samuel Mitchell of Pike County. He owned all the land lot 77, which is now the downtown south part of the downtown area of Atlanta. He made the state an offer that he would give them 5 acres if they'd move the terminus down to his land lot. And I never have found out just why the state thought they had to accept that, but they probably couldn't resist free land. So they did accept it, and the terminus was moved down to the 0 mile post, which is adjoining underground Atlanta. It's carefully preserved. It's our oldest man-made landmark right downtown. It was put there in 1850.
The city's permanent title was the result of one man's rather brilliant assumptions. Marthasville, with the railroad, her location and all, possessed unique prospects for growth, tremendous growth according to John Calhoun. He mentioned his prophecy to the train superintendent, who was offered a few suggestions including Atlantic and Atlanta. That's how Atlanta finally got her name. The railroad did set this town apart. By 1860 there were 10,000 citizens, 13 churches, 8 daily and weekly newspapers, a medical school with 156 students. An 1860 business listing ranked 17 different business industries. It was a town barely getting started when the war broke out. Of course, the political fervor was over the slavery and union issues. There wasn't a community anywhere, particularly this far south, that could avoid the issue. In the presidential election of 1860, Abe Lincoln did not receive a single vote from the town of Atlanta, nor the entire county. Georgia was the first state to leave the Union and the last state to readmit, some 6 years after the war. There were several major battles to the north, around Chattanooga, in the early months of the war. Atlanta, sitting so far deep in Dixie, seemed protected and would become the major manufacturing and war supply facility. And they produced everything here: tents, trunks, munitions, belt buckles, canteens, and coffins. No wonder Grant and his officers realized that to win the South, they would someday have to take Atlanta. It was 1864. Sherman and his army had taken Chattanooga and were given orders to keep heading south. Chickamauga, Kennesaw Mountain, Cheatham's Hill, Stone Mountain, and Peachtree Creek. They faced opposition at them all. Finally, the troops reached the northern bank of the Chattahoochee River in July. Everything else south of the Mason-Dixon had been captured but Atlanta. The last Confederate stronghold wasn't going to give in without a fight. For 40 days, the bombs struck. Finally, Sherman gave orders to the few remaining civilians that they should leave the town. Within 48 hours, his troops were gone. Atlanta was in flames. It took a very special people to return here after the fires were out, to come back to a place whose major businesses, railways and roads, the very backbone of the city, were destroyed. Folks like Dr. Henry Hornaday, who preached the first post-war sermon at the First Baptist Church, did come home and start cleaning and repairing and building again. It was odd how fast people moved back into Atlanta. She grew twice as fast in the 10 years after the war as she had in the 10 years prior. By 1887, she surpassed Savannah with over 37,000 residents. By 1900, 44 railroads had Atlanta offices. 150 passenger trains pulled in and out every day. The city continued to earn her nickname, the Gate City of the South. Atlanta was a city that didn't look back. She had an attitude that accepted all people. Atlanta was described in the 1960s as a city too busy to hate, but that was even true in the 1870s. One of the first black colleges in the country started here in 1869. People soon recognized Atlanta for her racial openness. For 30 years, the capital had been in Milledgeville, some 50 miles south of Atlanta. For the session in 1872, the local motels refused to allow the black representatives lodging, so it was agreed that they should all meet in Atlanta, and she should be the new capital. Plus, it was observed that the decision-makers enjoyed the bustle of Atlanta more so than the sleepy town of Milledgeville. The first state meetings were held in the Atlanta Opera House, sold to the state for $300,000 by H.I. Kimball. It is impressive to point out that the permanent Capitol building, finished in 1889, came in $118.43 under budget. One gentleman who arrived in Atlanta shortly after the war embodied the entrepreneurial spirit which would define this great city. Morris Rich moved here from Cashel, Hungary 2 years after the war. He set up shop downtown. Rich realized that the women in town probably didn't have the money to buy expensive lingerie, so he sold 50-cent corsets and 25-cent stockings. His service attitude was second to none. He even laid plywood in the street in front of his store so his customers wouldn't soil their new shoes. He extended credit to those who needed it. In his first year, he did $5,000 in sales. In 1985, Rich's department stores did over $647 million in sales. He became the first person in the South to departmentalize his store. In 20 years, he reported 75 departments and 800 employees. As you might have guessed by now, Rich's has grown into one of the largest and finest department stores in the country. In the last 2 decades of the century, the city held 3 World's Fairs in order to boost their economic development. Their World's Fair and Great International Cotton Exposition attracted 250,000 people in 1881. 4 years later, 1.25 million people visited the Cotton Exposition, which showcased the progress of the South some 30 years after the war. Booker T. Washington gave the address, which became known as the Atlanta Compromise. One of the most crucial events for this born-again city was the Automobile Convention of 1909. Sure, Atlanta was doing well. By this time, there were 100,000 citizens here. The railroad connected the city with Macon and Augusta, West Point, Alabama, and Montgomery. But other than that, the city, and for the most part the entire South, was essentially cut off from the rest of the industrialized nation for lack of roads. If Atlanta could prove to these visiting automobile execs that she was on the move, that Atlanta could provide both the necessary labor to manufacture automobiles and the aftermarkets to purchase them, then her fortunes could take a drastic step forward. Sure enough, the convention was a major success. 61 different auto manufacturers were represented. A few months later, Henry Ford started his Model T plant here. Within a year, 38 new automobile dealerships were started. By 1920, there were 80 such businesses listed in the city. Tourism began to have an impact on the region. Improvements in roads were planned to service the snowbirds heading south through Atlanta to sunny Florida. The city also became the fire insurance capital of the Southeast, with both the headquarters of the Southern Underwriters Association and over 50 home and foreign companies located here. The early 1900s were very exciting times for Atlanta. The city seemed to take off and prosper in many different directions. The skyline definitely took on a new shape with a dozen or so buildings 5 to 17 stories high. The new $6 million Biltmore Hotel was a real attraction. When this showplace opened, it was announced that the building had over 17 miles of carpet, enough carpet to stretch from Atlanta to Stone Mountain. In 1930, Atlantan Bobby Jones won both the British and American Amateur Golf titles and the British and American Open titles, thereby attaining the first and only Grand Slam. He is credited with making the game a popular sport for everyone. He started winning golf tournaments at age 9. Bobby was a student in the Emory School of Law in 1926 and 1927. And by the way, in 1933, a 100,000-gallon water tower was erected on the Emory campus and called the Bobby Jones Memorial because it looked like a giant golf ball on a tee. Dr. John Pemberton moved to the area from Knoxville, Tennessee in 1886 and perfected the formula for Coca-Cola in his homemade laboratory. It was initially to be used as a hangover cure. Frank Robertson was Pemberton's bookkeeper, and he's the one who came up with the name Coca-Cola, thinking that, quote, the 2 C's might look well together in advertising. Asa Candler, another pharmacist, bought the secret recipe for $2,300. Within 4 years, Coke was available in every state in the Union. He and business partner Robert Woodward parlayed that investment into one of the biggest, most successful businesses anywhere. In 1919, Candler sold his company for $25 million in what was the biggest business deal ever in the South until that time. Woodruff, the son of the leading banker in the Coca-Cola transaction, took over the company in 1923. His marketing genius made Coca-Cola the most recognizable logo in the world. Some even called the drink the holy water of the American South. Just how popular is Coke? The Coca-Cola people will tell you that if all the Coke ever produced were put in 6.5-ounce bottles and stacked on a football field, they would form a mountain 325 miles high. Coca-Cola was definitely good for Candler and Woodruff, but these men were unsurpassed in their generosity. One example of Candler's gratitude actually started with Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt and his $500,000 gift to Central University in Nashville, Tennessee. Not only did they change the name to Vanderbilt, but their church affiliation away from the Methodist. Well, this prompted the Methodists to look elsewhere for a sponsored school. It was in the Inman Park Methodist Church here in Atlanta that Bishop Warren Candler asked his brother Asa for a donation and received $1 million. Emory University became a reality. Robert Woodruff died in 1985, but gave away some $350 million in his lifetime, some $230 million to Emory University. Not bad for a guy who was asked to lead the school in his first year as an undergraduate. The black community here achieved national recognition for itself in the early 1900s. In 1867, the American Missionary Association chose Atlanta as its site for a new institute for higher education for blacks. By 1920, there were 72 black businesses and 20 black professionals located along Auburn Avenue in downtown. Called Sweet Auburn in 1930 by John Wesley Dobbs, it was the heart of the black community in Atlanta, and in 1950 was called the most important black business neighborhood in America. The boll weevil devastation on the cotton crops combined with the Depression in the 1920s and resulted in a major exodus from the city. Thousands left Atlanta for opportunities elsewhere. But the Chamber of Commerce began their Forward Atlanta movement and promoted their city with national advertising. Their slogan was, "Can you get along without an Atlanta branch?" 679 new firms moved here from 1926 to 1929. By 1930, Atlanta's population was over 250,000 people. In 1939, the city hosted almost 500 conventions. In the 40 years after the Civil War, investment in manufacturing grew from $14 million to over $200 million by 1910. The city received several notable appointments over other cities in the South. The national government made Fort McPherson a permanent post here. A federal penitentiary was built here in 1900 and a Federal Reserve District Bank in 1914. And with the resolution to bring technology to the state in 1888, Georgia Tech University was founded. In 1941, Delta Airlines moved its headquarters to Atlanta. It was originally called Huff, Dale and Dusters and specialized in crop spraying in the South. David Lewis and Wesley Newton reveal in their book that the name was adopted sure enough from the Mississippi Delta region. The company was led by C.E. Woolman, a one-time county agricultural agent, until his death in 1969.
This is the end of side 1. Please fast forward and turn the tape over to side 2.
About this same time, an Atlanta native was enjoying tremendous success with her work and drawing international attention to the city as well. Her friends called her Peggy, but Margaret Mitchell's name will always remain among the finest American writers ever. She was born here in 1900 on Kane Street. The family moved when she was 12 to 1401 Peachtree Street. Margaret herself claims she grew up in a time when children were seen and not heard. Like so many families in the South, she spent many a Sunday afternoon visiting her various aunts and uncles, where the normal conversation usually concerned the Civil War. She graduated from Washington Seminary, a private girls' school here. Later, she married Baron Kennard from North Carolina, but that lasted only a few months. He disappeared and was never seen again. His body was discovered in a motel in the Midwest a few years later. At age 22, Margaret became a writer for the Atlanta Journal magazine. She married again, this time the fellow who had been the best man in her previous marriage, John Marsh. In 1926, Margaret was laid up in bed recuperating from an illness. Her husband suggested she start writing that book she'd always talked about to relieve the boredom. Soon, all in her circle of friends knew she was writing a book. The setting for much of the novel was in Clayton County, so she spent a great deal of time in the courthouse in Jonesboro, just south of downtown. In 1935, Harold Latham, vice president from the Macmillan Publishing Company, came to town looking for manuscripts. It was a last-minute cancellation that afforded Mrs. Mitchell the privilege of joining Mr. Latham for dinner. While all her friends kept clamoring to Mr. Latham about her book in progress, Margaret herself kept quiet on the topic, until the evening he was heading out of town. She phoned and asked to see him. Mr. Latham recalled seeing a tiny woman with the biggest stack of manuscripts he'd ever seen. He had to buy 2 suitcases just to carry the script back to California. Well, the script was accepted for publication and published in 1936. It was called The Finest Novel Ever by an American Writer. Producer David Selznick finally got the movie rights for $50,000. The world premiere of Gone with the Wind was held in 1939 in the Lowe's Theater, formerly the famous DeGive Opera House, and now the site of the Georgia Pacific Company. The success never changed Margaret. She and her husband continued to live in the rather small apartment, which they called the dump, claiming she couldn't use a 20-room house and she didn't like the resorts. She did eventually hire a secretary to help her with the mail, approximately 600 pieces a day. The phone calls were frequent and occasionally humorous. One evening, an intoxicated man called and asked her what color Scarlett's hair was in the movie. She replied it was black. He only moaned and said, "I bet $50 it was red." In 1949, Margaret and her husband were walking down Peachtree when Hugh Gravitt, a drunk driver, came speeding down the road and struck her. She died 5 days later. Hugh already had 20 traffic violations against him and was sentenced to 18 months in jail. Inmates from the federal pen made a wreath of white roses and marigolds grown from inside the walls. Margaret had gone there often to lecture. Today there's a Margaret Mitchell room at the downtown library. It displays her typewriter, 24 translations of her book, awards, and the like. I spoke to Herb Bridges, the noted author, lecturer, and collector of the world's largest privately owned collection of Gone with the Wind memorabilia.
About 25 years ago, I got interested in Gone with the Wind. I have no idea why. I just did. Why does anybody pick up a hobby of collecting coins or collecting stamps or whatever? I just reread Gone with the Wind, got interested in it, and thought it would be nice to have a first edition of the thing. Searched in old bookstores in Atlanta and got a first edition, but it wasn't signed. And I thought, well, maybe I ought to get one that's autographed. So I began to search around, got one autographed, but none of them had a dust jacket on it. And I found out for people that collect antiquarian books that all these little points make a great difference. So I had to get another one that was with a dust jacket on it. Got that, and all of a sudden I've got, 5, 6, 7, 8 copies of Gone with the Wind. Isn't that dumb? Then I found out, well, there are several different American editions of the thing through the years. That's good marketing, just simply to republish the thing and put a different jacket on it or a different cover. I make a 2-volume edition. I make a paperback edition. Well, what do all these American editions look like? So I began to collect those. And there are about 14, maybe 15 different American editions. Got all those. All of a sudden, here's a hobby, Oh, well, this book's published all over the world. What does it look like in Japan or Italy or Germany? And then I thought, well, let's see. Let's see if I can get a copy of that. So I began to write antiquarian book dealers in foreign countries and began to get these foreign books. And extremely interesting, because of the maybe illustrations or how they were printed in 2-volume, 3-volume, 4-volume, 5-volume. Japanese even have a 7-volume edition and so forth. Because the Japanese don't like big books, so they split it. But Atlanta doesn't have anything to show people about Gone with the Wind. We're quite famous for Coca-Cola and Martin Luther King and Gone with the Wind. But there's nothing in the city to show you about Gone with the Wind. Now, you can go to the author's grave. Margaret Mitchell wrote the book it was published in 1936. And you can go and visit her grave in Atlanta. But that's not too exciting for convention people to go to the cemetery. Or you could go to her home site. I've done several books about Gone with the Wind, particularly the film. After the movie was made and premiered in Atlanta in 1939, it's been shown all over the world. And a lot of the collection of pictures that were made during the filming of the thing, because they didn't shoot any of the film in the South or in Atlanta. Every inch of the movie was made in California. So it was a big production. It was in Technicolor. And I've done a book about just called The Filming of Gone with the Wind, showing just pictures that were made by a still photographer, how the thing was made. Then we did another book called The Gone with the Wind, the screenplay, just actually taking the script and putting it in print for people if they wanted to check the dialogue of it. Then I did one book on collecting memorabilia about Gone with the Wind. It's called Frankly, My Dear, Gone with the Wind Memorabilia, showing all the material that's been produced through the years, books, posters, memorabilia like dolls and figurines and all that junk that was made when the movie came out. But if people come to Atlanta, visitors looking over the city, there are several sites that they should see while they're here. The Atlanta Public Library, the main branch downtown, has a collection of Gone with the Wind material that belonged to Margaret Mitchell. She left her personal collection of books and papers and things to her, and the library does have it on the main floor downside, a very small exhibit in about 6 little plastic cubicles on the main floor that people could visit there. And then just across the street from the library is the site of where the theater was located for the premiere of Gone with the Wind. The Lowe's Grand Theater is not there anymore, but the Georgia Pacific building is there. And in marble, carved in marble, in their entranceway, there's a monument there stating that this was the site of the Lowe's Grand Theater, so people should visit that. And then just across the street from that is a little triangle, which is called Margaret Mitchell Square. It's a very tiny little point there, but there's a waterfall and a little sort of memorial to Margaret Mitchell. There's a waterfall, which the water doesn't always run. The city doesn't seem to maintain it too good. Then, of course, there's a marker on Peachtree Street to show her house, a historical marker, saying that this is where she lived as a child. I have no favorite as far as part of the book. I just think it's interesting. The movie itself was extremely well made in the golden age of Hollywood, made in 1939, made in Technicolor. And I think the movie itself, of course, glamorized the book and so forth, and perpetuated the story simply by it being visual, and people over the world could see it. And it's amazing how people in Japan or Germany or France after World War II and the devastation there, I think they related to this story in this movie because of the destruction of the South during Civil War. And then they could see here is a person or a fictional character that survived.
Jimmy Carter symbolized the man from the New South. Naturally, the state took great pride in his election. He was an ROTC student at Georgia Tech before being accepted to the U.S. Naval Academy. After his military service was complete, he returned to handle the family business and eventually was elected to the state congressional seat his father had held. He was elected governor in 1970 and enjoyed much success with his reforms in welfare, taxes, environmental issues. He went on to win the office of the presidency in 1976. Folks the world over became curious about Georgia politics, its history, customs, and foods. Foreign investment even began increasing as a result of the international media exposure Carter received during his race. Gary Fink from Georgia State University says that Jimmy Carter's rise to the presidency represented in symbolic terms the ultimate reunification of the South with the rest of the nation. Since his presidency, Jimmy Carter has organized several organizations. The Habitat for Humanity program he started has, as its aim, the elimination of poverty housing. In 1988, their group built 2,000 homes in 150 locations in the United States and Canada. His International Executive Service Corporation mainly offers trips to retired business executives to assist developing nations. His other programs include the Friendship Force, Global Awareness Through Experience, and the Citizens Exchange Council. After September 20th, 1990, most citizens here started looking toward August 1996, the date of the 100th anniversary of the modern Olympic movement. The Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games, the ACOG, heads up the preparation here. Billy Payne, Andrew Young, and Charlie Battle are credited with getting the games here. Payne is a former University of Georgia football player who got the idea to hold the Olympics here. Initially, only Andrew Young, then mayor, and a former United States ambassador to the United Nations would support him. Dr. Leroy Walker, currently the treasurer for the USOC, is the senior vice president in charge of sports. A native of Atlanta, he coached the United States track and field team in Montreal in 1976. Bill Moss is senior vice president in charge of construction and capital programs. He headed up construction projects for the $1 billion Epcot Center in Orlando. The Georgia Dome will be the world's largest cable-supported domed roof area. It's scheduled for completion in March 1992. The games will be held from July 20th through August 4th, 1996. They will be the first Summer Olympics held in the eastern United States. The dome will serve as a gymnastics and basketball area. The Falcons will begin play there in the 1992 season. Along with the Georgia World Congress Center, it will be the world's largest sports and exhibition complex, holding over 70,000 fans. The Olympic Village will be on the campus of Georgia Tech. What else do the games mean to Atlanta? The 16-day event will mean 84,000 new jobs. The city will gain $500 million worth of new structures, at no cost, hopefully, to the city. A new open-air stadium for the Braves, an aquatic center at Georgia Tech, and a twin-tower dorm at Tech will remain. I spoke to Cecilia Corbin Hunter at the mayor's office about the upcoming Olympics.
Well, I'm director of the Mayor's Office of Olympic Coordination, which is the office designated to be the liaison with ACOG, the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games. So we are directly responsible for all of the city's interactions with ACOG and all that will be required of the city for putting on the games, whether it's police, the area of public safety, emergency management services, sanitation services, removal of trash from venues, permitting and code enforcement for building different Olympic venues, and for improving the Olympic impacted neighborhoods. And by that I mean all of the neighborhoods that have an Olympic venue in the city of Atlanta. So the Olympic Stadium will be in the community of Summer Hill. The Atlanta University Center is in Vine City, and they will host 2 venues there in the schools. And then and also in Vine City would be the Georgia Dome and the Omni, which are Olympic venues as well. The Techwood community, Techwood Clark Howell Homes, is part of what will be the Olympic Village, another venue, and Georgia Tech. So there will be a lot of building going on in the city for this, and we will be required to assist in the permitting process. Atlanta had a cross-section of participation. It was a diversified group that presented its face to the world. The Atlanta group on the bid visited every IOC member in their own hometown. And so we put forth the personal touch. It was people to people as opposed to a commercialized venture or a staged dog and pony show. It was much more of a personal interaction, getting to know people, inviting those members to Atlanta and allowing them to see us up close, to see not just our highways and our beautiful buildings and our rail system and a fabulous airport, but to see the people of Atlanta. We brought them into our homes. I would think that the mayor summed it up early on after the games were announced when he said that we would put on the best games ever and we would uplift the people. And so it is not just to do one or the other. We have to do both. We have to improve the spirit of the city, which by no means is one that's deficient, but to rise the level of expectation of the people who live in Atlanta, to improve our communities and to make our city, in fact, a better place to live, where more people will want to come and visit us in the future.
Today, Atlanta is the eighth largest city in the country. It sits nearly halfway between New York and New Orleans, almost the center of the southern states. The metropolitan area covers 18 counties. The toll-free dialing area of Atlanta is the largest in the world, some 60 miles square. Sociologists suggest that there are really two Georgias, the Atlanta metropolitan region and then the rest of Georgia. Atlanta has over 40% of the state's population, 46% of the state's employment, and 49% of the state's personal income. This is a city poised for the 21st century and called by many the world's next great city. Judith Webb is with the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce.
Commercially, at least until 10 years ago, Atlanta was probably best known as the home of Coca-Cola, and that has certainly been a tremendous legacy for us because it was about somebody coming up with an idea and selling it on the corner and eventually creating one of the biggest enterprises in the world. Today, though, Atlanta is probably best known for CNN, the commercial cable powerhouse is headquartered in downtown Atlanta. The Turner Broadcasting System now has 5 networks, but possibly the most visible is CNN and CNN Headline News, which is shown in more than 75 countries around the world. Other companies that make Atlanta home are Delta Airlines, which is arguably the largest carrier in the world since their merger with Pan Am, Georgia Pacific, which is one of the largest paper and pulp companies in the world. All of the major banks have huge operations here. More than 1,000 international facilities or operations of international companies are located in Atlanta today. And one of the most interesting things is the number of Japanese companies that we have here. There are more Japanese facilities in the state of Georgia than there are in any other state in the Union except for California. We're very proud of that. Part of the reason the Japanese and other international companies decide to locate here is because of Atlanta's position as the heartbeat of the Southeast. Atlanta was born because 2 railroads decided to come together here, and later it was because the street roads came together, the interstate highways, and later still it was the air routes. Today, however, it's the telecommunications and fiber optic pathways that are making Atlanta's destiny for the next century. We have more fiber optic cable laid here than any other city has in the whole country, and that sets us up really well for handling data processing and information transfer. Our corporate history has been cemented this year, probably with the biggest corporate relocation move that's happened in Atlanta since the early 70s when Georgia Pacific came here, and that is with the move of United Parcel Service, or UPS, from their headquarters in Greenwich, Connecticut, to Atlanta. We also saw Holiday Inn Worldwide move their worldwide headquarters to Atlanta, Saab Automobiles, and countless other companies moving either regional offices or distribution offices into the area simply because it's so easy to get in and out. The ambience of Atlanta, one of the reasons corporate relocation specialists and ultimately corporations tend to choose Atlanta, because Atlanta is a city that lives well. The quality of life here is unsurpassed. We have long green summers and warm, beautiful, gorgeous springs when all the flowers bloom, cool falls, and a winter that lasts long enough to see a sprinkling of snow and then is gone. You're 2 hours from the mountains, 3 hours from the coast. You have good schools, good universities, good housing. Just generally, it's a city that's easy to live in. And it's a city that accommodates all lifestyles. There are everything from inner city housing to farmhouses and everybody uses the city in that regard. But probably the best thing about Atlanta is its spirit of cooperativeness. Atlanta's a city that's about getting things done. If a problem is determined, people don't go around and point fingers at each other and say, well, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. They just sit around a table and solve the problem. It's a city where people, if you have an idea, it's a city where you can make it work.
This is the end of side 2. Please remove the tape and insert tape 2.